Listen only mode.
Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by Rocky Mountain Institute. I'm Kelly Vaughn, Marketing Director for Development. Today we're talking about resilience and transformation. This is a really timely topic as the global COVID pandemic has really forced us to address how we take on and face crises and ask ourselves when business as usual is no longer possible, really, can we imagine what is? Today, our panel will share how their work is improving energy resilience and in doing so, transforming our climate future in exciting ways. Thank you for our Solutions Council and Innovator Circle members who are joining us today. It's support from our giving circles and other donors around the world that make this work that we're discussing today and all of our work at RMI possible. So thank you for all of you who could join us today. And as for our agenda, we will start with a welcome and introduction of all of our panelists. Then we'll dive right into a discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to audience question and answer for the second half of our discussion here. Of course, you can pose your questions anytime to our panel by entering them into the chat function on your GoToWebinar dashboard on the right. So when we open it up to Q&A, we'll get to as many as we can. If we don't get to yours, don't worry. We hope to follow up with you after the close of this discussion, which we are recording and we will distribute to all of you after as well, so you can share it with people in your networks. Now, I am very excited to welcome some of my colleagues who will be discussing the interlinked topics of resilience and transformation today. So we'll start just by order of who is on my screen. We'll start with James, then go to David, Mark, and last but definitely not least, Sherry.
Great, thank you, Kelly, and hello, everyone. I'm James Sherwood. I'm a principal with Rocky Mountain Institute. I work with RMI's Empowering Clean Economies program, particularly our Africa Energy program, and lead a lot of our work in Nigeria. So really excited to talk to you all today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is David Gums. I'm a senior consultant with the Rocky Mountain Institute Islands program. I work in the Caribbean region, and a lot of the work that I'm doing is sort of focused around resiliency, particularly the effects resiliency has had in the Bahamas, Abaco, and also doing some work in Bermuda.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Dyson, a principal with RMI's electricity program. Been with RMI for about 10 years or so, and my work focuses on clean energy transformation within the United States electricity grid, and recently has taken a big focus on resilience and the emerging topics within the industry and how to use clean energy to improve resilience. Great to be here today.
Hi, I'm Sherry Villamoria. I'm a senior associate with Rocky Mountain Institute. I've been with RMI for about 5 years and have primarily focused on US electricity issues, but more and more have been focusing on building decarbonization, especially building electrification. Excited to share with you today.
Great, well, thank you all of you, and we're so pleased to have you joining us virtually from your own homes. So we'll start right and dive in right to our discussion. Each of you has played a role in RMI's recent work that ties together these integrated themes of energy resilience and long-term transformation of the energy system. Maybe we can start by each of you sharing what you've been working on most recently and what about this work is most exciting to you. And I think just for efficiency's sake, we'll go in the same order as we did our introductions. James, starting with you.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Happy to kick it off. So as I mentioned, I work with RMI's Africa Energy program, and our focus is really on accelerating access to clean, reliable, and cost-effective electricity, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, with a goal of enabling local economic development and sustainability for the communities that we work in. This has a direct link to resilience, as many of these communities that we work with currently lack reliable power or access to grid power at all, and as a result are forced to supplement with expensive alternatives like diesel generators and things like that. So RMI's work is focused on unlocking commercially viable alternatives, things like mini grids and microgrids and other distributed energy resources that embed power locally and thereby create resilience in these local communities to issues with the broader grid. We've released 2 projects this year which show this in practice. And I'll frame this up first, one project that's at a national level and one at a local level. At the national level in Ethiopia, we partnered with the Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy and the International Food Policy Research Institute to lay out the economic opportunity for using rural electrification to increase smallholder agricultural productivity. At the local level, just last week in Nigeria, we commissioned a first of its kind mini grid in the community called Mokoloki, where a utility and a solar developer partnered through an innovative business model to provide 24-hour power to a community that previously relied almost exclusively on diesel generation because of poor grid reliability. These alternative approaches really connect to the transformation element of all this, in that providing reliable and resilient power is pretty foundational to unleashing kind of the latent demand and the economic activity that's possible in these communities, but currently constrained by either lack of access or reliability or cost. With that, maybe I'll hand it to David. Thank you.
What's most exciting for me is the ability to work in the region where I was born and raised. I grew up in the island of Anguilla, and development of Anguilla and the region has always been something close and dear to my heart. So I'm excited that I can now link a lot of the work that I do on a daily basis to the development of the Caribbean region. And part of that, similar to what James talked about with the development in Africa, a lot of those relationships play or hold in the Caribbean also. But specifically, we did a green stimulus in the Caribbean white paper a couple of months ago that really brought together a lot of the different themes on how resiliency to the development of microgrids, expansion of EV development, wind energy, and energy efficiency sort of plays a role in creating jobs for the region. And particularly as it relates to the current circumstances that the world is currently experiencing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we showed basically how any stimulus programs, when tied to energy, can lead to the further development of the local economies, bringing back jobs, setting up a foundation that leads to growth of the local economy in terms of agriculture, tourism, and different sectors over the long term. So for me, it sort of feels good to contribute to the regional development in such a way that sort of leads to sustainability of the long term.
That's great. And just to remind everyone on the line today, not only did we publish this stimulus paper for the Caribbean region, but for all of the regions in which RMI works, in India, in China, in the US, and then we also had a discussion just about a month ago on the global stimulus principles. So I think if you're interested in checking out not only what the analysis and recommendations were for particular regions, you could look at how we're approaching stimulus and resilience in light of COVID overall. So thank you, David. Mark, on to you.
Great, thanks. So I'll start with what's most exciting to me about the work we've been doing recently, and that is just witnessing the pace of transformation in the United States electricity system and really the global electricity industry over especially the past 5 years. It has surprised everyone, including those of us who work at RMI, how quickly the costs have come down for clean energy, how rapidly utilities in some parts of this country and around the world are integrating clean energy into their resource mixes and at a speed that to date has been unprecedented. And it's exciting to think about that in the context of what's to come in the next 10 years. So, you know, really the transformation of this industry is really exciting to me. And then it dovetails in interesting and exciting and valuable ways with this topic of resilience. So I'll talk through a report that we released a few weeks ago, looked at both this trend of increasing transformation of the United States grid, and then also the emergence of significant risks to power system security and resilience that are emerging due to, for example, extreme weather driven by climate change, as well as other risk factors that have long been present in the grid, but are now either more likely, more impactful in terms of their impact on the economy, or both. And so in this national paper that we released a couple weeks ago, we took a hard look at both the pace of transformation and these emerging risks that are facing utility decision makers around the country, and laid out, after a couple years of research and partnerships with industry practitioners, a set of 4 principles that start to, I should say, realign and reimagine how the industry has approached resilience in the last century since the grid has been a thing, and reorient it towards the next decade and the next decades to come. And then we've applied that national perspective at a very local level. I'll talk about this more later, but 2 years ago, our local utility here in Colorado that serves the building that Kelly is sitting in right now, there was a fire that was started not far away from the RMI headquarters that, long story short, nearly took out power to the upper Roaring Fork Valley for at least a week due to burning down transmission line towers. And in response to that, we've applied some of these principles for grid resilience and helped the local utility put steel in the ground for clean energy projects in the valley that will, in addition to lowering costs and improving the community's clean energy sourcing ambitions, will also provide resilience in the case of another disaster. So excited to share a bit more about that later today.
Fantastic. Sherry, on to you.
Great. So my work also focuses particularly on transformation, and that's what's most exciting to me these days. I focus on eliminating direct fossil fuel use primarily in US buildings. So that's shifting away from burning natural gas or other fossil fuels in our furnaces for space and water heating, and instead using efficient electric devices that can be powered by renewables. And I too have been really excited to see the ways that the focus and conversation has changed really dramatically in the last couple years. We've convened groups of practitioners and policymakers who have been working on building electrification issues for a couple years now, and the dramatic change in focus, program, and intensity of effort has changed significantly. Direct building emissions represent about 10% of all US greenhouse gas emissions, and so moving away from those emissions and eliminating those emissions is crucial for us to meet our climate goals. And switching to electric devices today saves carbon in 46 out of 48 states, and that's due both to the high efficiency of electric heat pumps, as well as the ways that the grid is getting cleaner due to coal retirements and all of the renewable and storage components that Mark was just talking about. But at the same time, we have continued to build out the natural gas system and install gas appliances, which is really digging the hole deeper. So it's been really exciting to see all of the ways that regulators and government agencies, utilities, and other folks are beginning to think about how do we begin to move away from that. So specifically, my recent report is around regulatory solutions for building decarbonization. So really looking at the questions and considerations that regulators and other state government agencies need to be thinking about as we move away from natural gas towards all electric buildings. There are a couple specific recommendations that I'm happy to talk through later, but particularly thinking about ensuring first that there's a state level vision for aligning the future of utilities with the climate imperative, as well as thinking about how we support the market for clean energy solutions and really think about how we actually get these devices into buildings and how to get people to make different choices, as well as really thinking about the gas system, both how do we stop expanding the natural gas distribution system when we know that those are likely to end up stranded assets if we are to meet our climate goals. And along with that, how do we begin to think about winding down the natural gas distribution system in a way that is affordable, equitable, and safe?
Fantastic, thank you. And as we think of the broader theme of resilience and transformation, I think one thing to note is that a lot of the work RMI is doing is not only helping communities that have been impacted by severe weather, such as the storms and the hurricanes in the Caribbean or wildfires in Colorado and California, you know, you're not only supporting near-term recovery with more resilient systems, but you're looking forward as to how can the systems that we put in place transform the system over the long term to address the climate risk overall, right? So when we think about both near-term recovery and long-term resilience and transformation, all of you work in very, very different areas that have, you know, diverse needs, motivations, economic climates, so on and so forth. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about how the work that you're doing is very much rooted in the place in which you work, and how are you preparing the communities that you're working with directly to create more resilient energy systems, and really how are your solutions kind of tailored to the communities in which you work? David, we'll start with you, given your close connection with the region that you're working in right now.
Sure, happy to. I think the principle sort of laid out in the Caribbean stimulus white paper is great. And conceptually, it's all the things that we would love to do if we had a magic wand. A lot of the work that we do on the ground, however, is where the real action happens, and implementation of a lot of those recommendations is where it's really rewarding to see it in action. Some of the work that we've done, particularly in Abaco after the recent hurricane there, it really has, it was rewarding because in a lot of ways, one, it reminded me of Hurricane Irma and the direct experience I had going through Hurricane Irma. And within days, you know, after the passing of Hurricane Irma, we were in touch with RMI to help us rebuild the 1 megawatt solar farm that we had lost practically at 100% to rebuild it better. And RMI took on the initiative and essentially went out and did a comprehensive study on solar farms throughout the region, the impact of the hurricane, and helped us to basically develop the specifications to build back better when we rebuild the solar farm. And also they helped us sort of through the procurement process and so forth, where we were going out for the RFP. Now, those are very specific on the ground things that I now have the privilege to participate in. And going back to the Bahamas allowed me to sort of be active on the ground, helping the Bahamas rebuild and build back better. So designing the microgrid systems there, you know, because my background as a CEO of an electricity company in Anguilla, I had the privilege to sort of add a unique perspective in terms of how those systems not only will add to the resiliency of the region or the islands of the Bahamas, but also how they're going to actually improve the performance of the electricity system, the electricity grid, and the power generation system. So that's a very specific project that is very hands-on, very, we showed the economic benefits and everything associated with the design and the concept that we put forward. And also, on the other end, working in some of the other islands just to plan and help them reach their, you know, their transition objectives. Some islands like Bermuda in particular has a very aggressive objective to reach, our ambition to reach, I think it's 80% by 2040. That's going to require an incredible amount of work. So having the ability to work hands-on and assist in that transition process has been very rewarding.
Great, Mark and Sherry, it sounds like, you know, to David's point about economics and proving the case is really winning the day. Can you talk a little bit about your work in the US and how there are some similarities and differences based in the communities in which you work?
Sure. So I'll talk a bit about the Holy Cross Energy work, which is the local utility that serves our headquarters up in the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado. So as I mentioned, they had a really close call with a fire that, you know, came very close to disabling power supply for up to a week or more. for the community. And as we engaged with the utility after that brush with disaster, we learned a lot of things that are very specific to the community in which we worked. For example, as part of the work we did, we came to understand that many customers, including both residential, but also mostly commercial and industrial or light industrial customers in the valley, had existing backup power sources, and in many ways felt that they were prepared for an outage to the broader grid system that Holy Cross Energy manages. But we also learned that they weren't prepared for a week-long outage, right? Their diesel tanks, for example, weren't big enough to run a backup generator for a week or more. And so we helped the community understand the limits of their previous preparedness for disaster. And on the flip side, we helped connect the dots between what the utility was doing, kind of upstream, if you will, of the customer, in terms of hardening their grid and managing vegetation, fire risk, and things like that that are standard kind of operating procedure for a utility. And we help connect the dots between those activities and actually leveraging the resources that customers already had within their facilities or were interested in procuring for their facilities, so that they could more cost effectively integrate all of the power resources and all of the other strategies across the community for resilience in the event of an outage in a much less costly way than it would cost to build redundancy from the ground up or harden the grid to the 6 nines that it would take to really limit the possibility of an outage. And so we found a lot of economic value in this very community-driven approach that took both the resources and the interests of the community, in the same breath as the mandate for reliable and resilient service. And in that way, we found many projects that the community and the utility could work on going forward that would jointly meet all of their goals.
Great. I can speak a little bit less around disaster resilience, but thinking about health and safety and the way that we increasingly know that gas stoves pose real health and air quality risks. I am based in New York, and we've been doing some work both with the City of New York and other stakeholders thinking about how, as we are thinking about electrification, how important this health and equity piece fits in, especially as we know that susceptibility to COVID is very related to air quality, and both susceptibility to COVID as well as air quality risk is very connected to race and class and where you live within New York. So really thinking about how to engage with communities and how different stakeholders from city government agencies, whether sustainability or housing folks or the Department of Health, how all of these different stakeholders can work with utilities and communities to really both make sure that the awareness around the risks of gas stoves is well known, but also that people have real options and know what they can do to mitigate their risk and what choices building owners and others have going forward. And speaking sort of the specificity of place and specific questions in specific geographies, a question that comes up a lot when we talk about building electrification in New York is around the fact that New York has a lot more multifamily renters than many places. And this is a quite specific example, but thinking about the ways when we think about equity and wanting to make sure that costs are not increasing for low-income customers. Traditionally, this is true in my apartment, your landlord pays for heat and you pay for your electricity. And we know that we need to be electrifying all buildings in order to, or the vast majority of buildings very quickly in order to meet our climate goals. But in doing that, we can't have the cost of that now electric heat be shifted just to renters who are already having trouble meeting their bills. So really thinking about resilience from a variety of angles, including affordability as well as health.
Fantastic, thank you. And James, I know that not only does air quality and health underpin social equity, but through your work, you've seen quite a bit that resilience is tied incredibly to energy access. Tell us a little bit about how energy access and resilience are really integral to the work that you've done.
Yeah, definitely. And, I'll say kind of separate from that question, this is such a cool question to talk about with this group. And I think one of the things that makes RMI unique, and having been with the Institute for close to a decade now, is that we do try to connect really closely to the communities and the customers that we're working with and designing solutions around. So, it's easy to kind of get lost in the global energy transition and the 1.5 degree stuff and pulling levers and big models. But I think what we do try to do, and it's really fun to hear the stories from around the Institute, is get close to the ground and really connect and understand what the real challenges are. So yeah, in Africa, that's been fundamental to the work that we've been doing, is really going out and meeting with communities and understanding what their real challenges are, not just kind of what the government is saying or what the utility is saying, but what customers are actually experiencing. So, I'll go back to the Mokoloki project that I mentioned earlier, which was the mini grid in Nigeria that we commissioned last week. That definitely connects, resilience by providing electricity locally, which is pretty straightforward. But to your point, Kelly, it also connects to some of the, I guess, broader types of resilience or lenses that we could look at resilience through, particularly actually local economic resilience. So this has been really front and center in the past few months. The mini grid came online back in February, so right as COVID was really taking hold, and it's been huge for the community to be able to operate more self-sufficiently during the pandemic and the lockdown in Nigeria. There have been more services available locally, so healthcare. The clinic has had reliable electricity, which is obviously really important for medication and vaccine cold chains. They don't rely on the local diesel supply chain, so they don't rely on going to other communities or other communities coming in to supply diesel. Similarly, at a macro level, one of the things that we've seen is that this reliable electricity access can enhance the role of rural communities in national economies, particularly when it comes to agricultural value chain. So in Nigeria, this is a big deal where it's a highly agricultural economy, and currently some of that is done at a more industrial scale, but a lot of it is still contained in rural communities. And what providing reliable electricity access does is clear a pathway for oil independent economic growth. So export diversification by increasing agricultural productivity, and that at a macroeconomic level makes a country like Nigeria more resilient to global oil price shocks like we've seen over the last 6 months.
Great, and building on all of these fantastic local examples, right? It's so rewarding when, I'm sure, when you're able to work deeply with a community and different leaders within a community to build a solution truly from the ground up. But when we talk about scale, right? When we talk about truly transforming a system, that requires scale. And as we find ourselves in a truly decisive decade on climate, where we have just 10 years to cut global emissions in half, right? We really need to think about how these key learnings that we get from on the ground projects to scale quickly. And there's many different ways that your work is seeking to do that. So I'd love to dig a little deeper into scale and how the learnings from what you've done in a single community or multiple communities can be stripped out and shared with others to truly drive scale at the rate required to address climate change on time. So Mark, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. I think I'll return, once again to the work with Holy Cross Energy and the resilience, specifically in response to wildfire risk in Colorado, and then talk about kind of the way in which we've approached that work that allows it to be accessible and allows those proof points to inspire others both across the state of Colorado and also within the broader Western US and internationally as well. So a couple ways that we designed that project for scale at the start are worth mentioning here. The first is we invited out of like external non-community members to the work that we did in the Roaring Fork Valley, so that they could take some of those lessons. They could see the proof points. They could understand why, for example, a local solar plus storage project not only improved community resilience, but also allowed for the community to meet its clean energy goals and to lower its electricity supply costs. So they saw that on the ground, and then they went back to their communities outside of the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado, and in at least a couple cases started their own processes to prepare their own communities for the risks of fire that we know are not narrowly focused within our community in the Roaring Fork, but are in fact statewide and increasingly westwide. So we invited others in. We chose our partner wisely so that the utility itself could be an evangelist for the work. So the utility CEO in particular has been speaking about the lessons learned and about how they can inspire and inform others in the industry how to take action, so that it's not just a couple megawatts in Colorado, but it turns into hundreds of or thousands of megawatts across the country. And then finally, we in the public work we publish, we generalize, right? We make recommendations not only for the utility and the community in Colorado, but say, on the same page in a different column, how those lessons can be applied nationally. So you see the picture of the solar and storage project, and then you understand what the 3 things you need to do to make that happen and make it work for resilience and cost and climate in your community as well. So that's just one example of the way that we take these local lessons and really design the work around them for scale from the ground up.
Fantastic. James, I'd love to hear from you as well, because in a way, as I understand, that Mokoloki project is sort of a flip of that of that model, right? Where some thought leadership around undergrid, mini grids really did serve as the basis for Mokoloki. Then that serves as a proof point. Tell me a little bit about how you approach scale in the region in which you work.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with the framing that Mark used of proof points as sort of being where the rubber hits the road and where people really look for ideas to replicate. But you're right. In this particular case, we did start, gosh, it was a little over 2 years ago, I think, with really, again, meeting with the community and understanding what their challenges were and seeing this crop up again and again in a number of different communities. And then going to the drawing board and saying, okay, how do we design a business model that'll work for the utility, that'll work for the developer, that'll save money for the community? And, first of all, does that make sense? Does that exist? And if it does, then how do you do it in practice? So we went through that process and, wrote a report that came out of that. Also formed a lot of, and this is really critical, local partnerships. So with organizations that, both had some deeper content expertise in certain areas where RMI didn't, at least in Nigeria, and also who would be well positioned to take the work forward and help to replicate it as there was more interest and really help it along that scaling journey. So from that, we found the partnership with the utility and developer for this particular project and created that proof point, which is from the start really been framed around a market-led solution, something that can be replicated, that isn't totally reliant on development funding and some of the things that drive a lot of projects today, which is still really important. But what we really want to get to is something that's commercially viable and sustainable over the long term. It's actually been great to see this play out over the last week in practice, where since we launched the project, we've gotten a number of calls from other utilities, other developers, other government agencies in Nigeria and abroad who have sort of been saying, this looks great, this seems like it makes a lot of sense, I could do this in my utility, in my jurisdiction. How do I do that? Help me do that. So I think that kind of market-led dynamic is really what people are looking for, and providing the proof point, which can either start, as Mark said, with the kind of Holy Cross example of a particular project and building out from there, or the other way around, starting with thought leadership and kind of looking for a way to test it in the real world.
Great. And Sherry, I know that with your program, you know, a lot of times we use market forces as the scaling mechanism, but you're in a position where you're really seeing policy and regulation as a scaling force for the work that you're doing. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Sure. I'll say I think we need all the tools in the toolbox. So definitely we're using policy and regulation, and also there's a lot of market work that is needed as well. But if we start with some of the thought leadership that we worked on a few years ago, we showed that it was cost effective to electrify today, particularly in new construction. And then last summer, the city of Berkeley, partially using that analysis as part of the argument, actually banned natural gas in new construction. So all newly constructed buildings in Berkeley are required to be all electric. And at first, there was definitely some response that like, all right, that's Berkeley, but that's not going to happen anywhere else because it's Berkeley, California. But at the same time, we know that that can often be where things begin. The example that was often used was curb cuts on the sidewalk to allow for wheelchairs or strollers or other things was considered a radical idea when Berkeley required it first, and now that is something that you see across the nation. And indeed, yes, dozens of cities, both across California as well as some interest in other places around the nation, have required all electric new construction codes and are requiring buildings to be all electric, which is really exciting and definitely feels like our analysis and that initial proof point in Berkeley has led to much greater things. And now we're seeing state level action as well, partially in response to that. Both California and New York have open proceedings that are really looking at the long-term future of the natural gas system and how that aligns with climate goals and what will have to happen in order for the natural gas system to align with climate goals. Likely there is another proceeding opening in Massachusetts around the same question, and likely in other states as well. So it's been really exciting to see how that thought leadership has grown into real action and really long-term thinking. And our hope is that the many recommendations and framing that we offer in our recent report can really support that work going forward.
Great, and David, I'm actually going to wrap our first audience question into sort of a follow-up on my question to you. Sometimes the scaling mechanism can be on the technical side, right? And in our Islands program, there's been a great deal of thought leadership on the engineering of solar panels to withstand Category 5 hurricanes, and you know, different ways that arrays can be designed to stand up to storms. One question that came in from our audience is one way that the work you're doing builds resilience is by harnessing the power of local resources and local energy. In the Caribbean, you have abundant solar, lots of sunny days. How is your team thinking about storage with this excess of solar, and how do you approach the solar plus storage as a key aspect of your resilience strategy?
Yeah, and that ties into the scale discussion also, because in the Caribbean, one of the biggest challenges we have to overcome is achieving that scale where we have, you know, a reduction in costs or economies of scale on most of our initiatives. And when we go or increase the capacity on the solar side, because of the small independent grids that exist, and much of them are vulnerable because they've been hit by storm after storm and may not be in their best shape. So integrating renewable energy is always a concern. So that's where storage comes into play. And what we have been able to demonstrate in several islands thus far is that if we go for larger capacity in terms of penetration levels, add in storage, we can not only benefit from the economies of scale, but we can actually use the batteries for multiple purposes. So because the technology has come such a long way and the cost has declined tremendously, we can now use batteries for dispatch, black start, frequency management. There's so many different advantages to doing this that we can actually demonstrate the financial benefits of doing this, you know, because if it means dispatching a 10 megawatt genset versus a 10 megawatt battery for a short duration of time, you're better off producing that energy during the day via solar, wind or otherwise, and storing it and dispatching at 7 p.m. via the battery versus starting up a 10 megawatt genset, which burns diesel. So you're polluting and you're increasing cost.
Yeah, Sherry, actually to build on that, one thing that we're always conscious of at RMI is the whole system, right? And that if you aren't, I think the age-old Amory parable about parachuting cats is that if you don't see the entire system, that sometimes often the solutions to a problem become an even bigger problem in and of themselves. And Sherry, I'm sure you see that a lot with the work that you do with trying to move quickly toward fully electrified buildings that are powered by clean energy, and that requires the electricity grid to be increasingly clean. Can you talk a little bit about how your team is thinking about resilience in the sense of building electrification as something that can enable a more rapid cleanup of the grid and maybe reduce that need for battery capacity or serve as a source of load flexibility? I'm just trying to give our audience a sense of how we're seeing this idea of resiliency come full circle as it cuts across not only the power sector, but also the building sector. Even we don't have any representatives from our transportation team today, but even electric vehicles in the mobility sector. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Great. Thank you for bringing that up. So indeed, the question that often comes up is, if you're going to grow the electric load this much, won't that cause a lot of problems? And I think we definitely need to be thoughtful and careful as we're thinking about electric planning. And so my team works closely with Mark's team in thinking about how all of this is going to have to work together. But I think it's also important to note the ways that all electric buildings can really be grid assets, and grid interactive buildings can help to balance variable renewables. The example that I always give is, you really do not care when your water heater has heated your water as long as you can take the shower when you want to. And that is, in fact, a real example. You can have a smart water heater that will overheat or superheat the water in times of low cost electricity, perhaps so there are excess renewables. And then in times of higher cost electricity, you wouldn't have to use the electricity in that time for that purpose without any interruption to comfort. So there are real demand flexibility options and opportunities that should be considered alongside building electrification, and will continue to grow there. But thinking also about the way rooftop solar and storage can play into making electrification more cost effective, and really thinking about that whole system approach.
Excellent. Our next question is around on-the-ground implementation. Obviously, our climate challenge is global. A lot of the solutions and very practical and effective solutions to resilience have been driven at a local or community level. What advice would you give to communities that are seeking to use RMI's learnings and resources and to apply them to their own different communities? James, I will start with you, since you've worked in many different regions around the world.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that is easiest to lose sight of, that a lot of RMI's work really focuses on, is the business case for the various parties involved. There's one way to go about it, which is focusing on resilience and focusing on a lot of the benefits that we all know are really important but are also hard to quantify. And then there's another way to go about it, which is to say, how do we get a project that delivers all of those things but also fits into these nice existing economic boxes that are easy for different parties to check? So I think that's a fairly universal thing, although I'd be interested in David and Mark and Sherry opining on that as well. But certainly I think that's the thing that is easiest to lose sight of is, sort of saying this would be great to have. It will bring a lot of benefits. We want it, but not necessarily having fully thought through how to make it work for the utility or how to make it work for a project developer. And just, those are often workable questions and there is a solution to them, but it does require that next step of saying, okay, well, what motivates the utility? How do we make it fit within what they're able to do and how they're able to operate? So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me, but what do other panelists think?
I'll go. I think having been on both sides of the equation, I've actually seen the direct benefit because when I'm able to pick up the phone and call somebody I trust, and for me, that's partly the way RMI operates and works. We're independent. We're there to basically enable the transition, and we do that in a way that is sustainable and proven. So we're looking at best practices. We're looking at, so we spend a lot of time looking at this stuff, studying this stuff, absorbing this stuff. So as the CEO of a utility, I didn't have the time of day to be focusing on this all day, every day. I'd have loved to, but with the litany of employee matters and operational matters and political matters, just no time in the day to do it all. So for me, RMI served as that sort of trusted partner where I can go pick up the phone, have a phone call, say, hey, I'm hearing about this. Can you tell me a little bit more? And next thing you know, I got a litany of things, focus on exactly what I needed to do, recommendations. And that's the way now we work with our partners in the islands and across the world. We are seen as that trusted source on the ground that can assist partners at every level. So I'm not a very deeply knowledgeable about EVs. I have some very superficial information, but there are other people in RMI who I can lean on and bring into the mix and bring in and say, hey, I need some support on this initiative that we're working on. And I think that's probably one of the most valuable things that we offer to the region, that trusted partner.
And I'll add something, a little bit of a different flavor in my response here. I think one of the really cool things about working at RMI for me is that we make it easier for local decision makers or state or regional decision makers to learn from their peers, not just learn from us, but actually learn from their peers. And the example I'll give here is our work within the Electricity Innovation Lab over the past 6 or 7 years, where what started as a ragtag group of people interested in distributed energy and utilities who are on the cutting edge has evolved into an organization that has touched thousands of individuals, hundreds of companies and other institutions, including policymakers and regulators. And so now we kind of remove ourselves from the loop, right? Like we serve as a coordinator for a network of leaders and learners who can easily share best practices and take the lessons that we have helped pilot in different parts around the US and around the world and really understand very efficiently how to apply that to their own particular situation. So it's another way that we've set up a scaling mechanism for some of this on the ground work that lets decision makers at the local or regional or state level really take charge.
I love it. Only at RMI will you hear someone say, we're most successful when we work ourselves out of a job. Sherry, do you have any perspective on this?
To be honest, I think they covered a lot of the comments that I was going to say, especially around thinking about making sure that solutions work for a variety of stakeholders and being able to work well and as a trusted partner to a variety of folks.
Fantastic. We had a question come in around what policies or regulatory structures you've come across that you feel are most helpful in addressing mini grid installations. I know that those policies are going to be very, very different in developing economies versus developed economies. This gentleman specifically asked about Denver. So maybe I'll ask first about regulatory schemes that we've seen in the US that we can refer to and helping to advance mini grids. And then maybe we'll talk about, James and David, what you've seen in the Caribbean and in Nigeria and other regions in Africa in which we work that, we may see some common threads. Mark, we'll start with you.
There's honestly less of a case for microgrids and mini grids in Denver, for example, than there would be in some of the situations that James or David have described in other parts of the world. But that said, I think some of the most encouraging progress we're seeing is when utilities who might not necessarily see a business case or a customer value proposition for a mini grid or a microgrid in the United States, they make the problem bigger, right? So Amory Lovins used to, and still does, quote General Eisenhower and saying, when a problem can't be solved, you must enlarge it, right? You must include more decisions within the scope of the problem so that you can solve it. And mini grids and microgrids are an example of that in the United States, where if you're only planning around economics, it doesn't necessarily make sense. If you're only planning around reliability, as utilities typically define it, it doesn't make sense. But if you start to take into account the value of resilience, and in particular, the growing threats that grid security, that are facing grid security in the United States, it can start to make sense. And so, again, the best kind of momentum that we've seen is when utility planners start to account for these bigger picture risks and really understand how they might affect specific communities and take action or start pilot programs to really test some solutions that they might not otherwise have considered.
James, what about you?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. I was going to add one more thing from a US perspective, reflecting on some work that RMI has done with the US military over the years. One of the other things that can really help to make the case in the US from an economic perspective is the availability of markets for different grid services. So David mentioned earlier, batteries are an example of how you can provide lots of different services to the grid depending on the situation. So having an independent system operator like CAISO or PJM providing the ability for a mini grid or microgrid to sell into the market and kind of offset some of the additional cost by earning some additional benefits can help to unlock what Mark just described. From a regulatory perspective, in sub-Saharan Africa, what we've seen be really helpful, and Nigeria is a great example of this, where there's a regulation on the books specific to mini grids and laying out some of the kind of guardrails for development, but not being over specific. So what the government and what the regulators have really tried to encourage is experimentation and innovation by providing the necessary kind of foundation to say this is okay. We're encouraging you, utilities, developers, to experiment with things along these lines, but not being so specific that it makes it hard for people to actually get real projects done. So finding that balance of encouraging pilot projects, encouraging innovation, but not being too restrictive.
Yeah, and I'll say ditto, because in the Caribbean region, I find it's most successful when there is a partnership between the regulator, utilities, and governments, because we can be fighting for the next 10 years, or we can work together to actually accomplish, projects at scale and develop and grow. And I think in the Caribbean region, with the exception of a few countries, the regulatory bodies are relatively new. So there's still different models that are being tried and different approaches, and that sort of flows with the politics from time to time. But many of the islands actually don't have regulatory bodies, or a particular ministry may be indirectly regulating the utility. But what that allows is for for us to come in as a trusted partner amongst all the parties, on the regulatory side, on the government side, and on the utility side, and actually, based upon our experience and success in other islands, basically demonstrate that we're better off having a successful outcome than spend a lot of time and energy fighting about exactly these territorial sort of fights that can happen from time to time to disrupt any progress. So I think that's sort of, in a way, we're benefiting from not having those structures formally in place and the territories already sort of parceled out, everybody protecting their domain. But on the other end, where there are regulators, we sort of play that cohesive role in making sure that we're bringing sort of trust to the relationship, because there's sometimes could be that distrust between, for many reasons, for the politics of it, for the economics of it, or for the power plays. So hopefully that answered the question.
Great. Well, I would love to take the last few minutes to get your final thoughts, each of you on the panel. If you were to leave our audience with, you know, a key thought of yours or experience or anecdote about the significance of resilience and system transformation in energy and climate, what would you like to share before we let everyone go today? And I'll start with the bottom of my screen. Sherry, we'll start with you, then Mark, David, and finally James.
Great. Well, I think the thing that I find most crucial to keep in mind is, what is the goal? The goal is 1.5 degrees Celsius. The goal is to have emissions in the next decade and eliminate them by 2050. And when you think about the goal in that way, it becomes clear that things like an increased efficiency of a gas furnace is not going to get us there. And so really thinking about the scale and the system transformation that is needed to get us there. And then thinking about what the implications of that are and all of the different stakeholders and decisions and clear vision and planning that will be needed to get us there. So in my case, that involves spending a lot of time thinking about the future of the natural gas distribution system and how do we think about transitioning away from it and winding that down in a way that is equitable, affordable, and maybe seems like an absurd proposition based on where we are today. I have a radiator that's based on a gas boiler right behind me, and it seems hard to imagine that tomorrow that would be an electric heat pump, but I know that to get where we need to go, we have to keep our eye on the prize.
I guess my closing thought will be around resilience. I think we have witnessed in the past 5 years, with the effects of extreme weather driven by climate change and other threats, and just a fundamental reassessment of the importance of grid resilience in our economy. And we have two choices. We can either embrace the status quo and kind of double down on the strategies that have kind of worked for the past century to maintain the security of the grid, or we can, you know, go full in on the energy transition and really embracing the pace of transformation. And I guess I'd like to leave folks with the idea that the latter is clearly the better option at this point, and we're working hard every day to make sure that that makes the most sense to the most people.
Yeah, so I'll take off where Mark left off. Essentially, that's, you know, after 2017 Hurricane Irma, and rebuilding the Anguillian grid, and spending lots of time, energy, heart, soul, blood, sweat, and tears in doing so. A lot of discussion at the time was focused around undergrounding. We spent, you know, weeks trying to convince the public we were rebuilding the way we had to at the time. And everyone would say, why don't you just go underground? And oh, it's costly and so forth. And then we talked about, you know, microgrids, naturally evolve into microgrids, because we had one part of the island off, and for a very long time, we took 100 days to get to the western end of the island. That's the heart of our tourism product, and that's where most of the hotels are located. And there was much discussion, why don't we microgrid that section of the island? Well, yeah, we can do that, but not right now. We got to get electricity back. And so all that discussion sort of now, you know, sort of comes into play. Here's where microgrids are absolutely critical in terms of building that resiliency and sustainability for the long term. Now, beyond that, we've now demonstrated how the economics make sense for a Caribbean island. It brings jobs, and it also sets up the islands for lower cost energy, which helps the industries. The main industry, most of the Caribbean islands, is tourism, agricultural sector, and many, many more things that it relates to. And you hear this in the politics of the island all the time. So what's left is the implementation and sort of assisting the islands in that transitional pathway. And that's what, you know, I'm excited about, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to work on. And I think if we can build up that momentum, island by island, it would be within 10 to 20 years, full transition in that region.
It's kind of hard for me to add much to that. I'll just say the one other thing that comes to mind is, as we go through this transformative process, it doesn't need to be an adversarial process. So through partnerships and by working together, and I know that sounds a little cheesy, but really bringing organizations together to kind of look at this from different angles can have a marked difference in how easy it is to then go from an initial project to scale.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all of you for your great dialogue. We appreciate you sharing all of the work that you're doing, and thank you for your leadership in the energy transition. And thank you everyone in our audience for joining us today. We appreciate your engagement and questions and hope to see you on a future webinar. So we wish you all a great rest of your day and hope that you stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.